Welcome to Dog on the Plot. Obviously, we're not on the plot, and that's because it's my annual plan a plot from a hot tub video. And if that sounds odd to you, bear with me, all will be explained. So every year in January, the girls in my family and I come on a hot tub lodge break. It's to dispel the January blues, extend the Christmas festivities for a little bit longer, and just generally have a nice time together and do a little something for our well-being. But my cousin and I also take this as an opportunity to plan our gardens and allotments. So we bring all our gardening books, we bring the seed catalogue, we bring graph paper and ruler and pens, and we think about what we want to do with our gardens and allotments for the upcoming year. And that's especially important this year because obviously I have a new plot to plan. So what I thought we'd do for this week's video is think about planning a plot. So whether you've got a brand new plot or you're starting over on your old plot for the new season, there's lots of things to kind of take into consideration. And there was a major thing that I had to do on my new plot before I could even start thinking about planning this weekend, and that was to actually uncover the plot. So if you've been following along on this journey so far, you'll be aware that when I took on my new plot, the previous tenant had weeded it, dug it over, and covered everything, almost everything, in black plastic. So although I've got sort of the rough dimensions of the entirety of the plot, and obviously there's some structures already on there, like the polytunnel and the greenhouse, I didn't actually know sort of the layout of the beds underneath the tarpaulin. I didn't know the measurements of those. I didn't quite know where the paths were underneath. And there was a lot of slabs like dotted around that were holding the tarpaulin down. So I thought really the first thing that I needed to do with my new plot is just take an assessment of the space. So get the black tarpaulin off and look at what I was working with. Now, before I could even get to the point of uncovering the beds, I had to take everything off of it that had been dumped on it. So during the plot move, basically just everything from the old plot got dumped onto the black plastic on the new plot. So all of that had to come off first. So there was obviously the greenhouse had to come off. There were all the covers that Graham had made, the previous tenant, so they had to come off, the bed, the swing set frame that I use for climbing beams and things like that. So all of that had to get shoved off. Then we were able to take up the black plastic and reveal what was underneath and the layout of the beds. And what I was really pleased to find is there is a lot of slabs under there. They weren't quite in the pattern that I wanted, and this leads me, I think, to one of my main considerations for thinking about a new plot or designing a plot, and that is to have the path that you want. So on my old plot, it had very higgledy-piggledy beds, and you had to sort of go in a sort of zigzag pattern to get from one end of the plot to the other, which is just a real pain. And it wasn't long from being on the old plot that I tried to make a path that went directly up the side of the plot. So I was really pleased there were a lot of slabs that I could use, and we started to reconfigure the pattern slightly on the plot. Also because I kind of had an idea of where I wanted the greenhouse to go. And the general kind of look of the plot as you moved on to it. And you might have kind of picked up on this from my home garden, but I do actually quite like things symmetrical. And I really wanted the new plot to have that kind of symmetrical feel so that you could come up the center of the plot, the greenhouse be in the middle, and then everything around it be identical on each side. No, so not necessarily the crops that I'm going to be growing in the beds, but just the beds themselves, the kind of structure, the main layout of the plot would be symmetrical. And I think when you're thinking about your plot, especially if it's a new plot, know your style, know what it is that you like. And what I learned from the old plot is don't be too limited by what is already there. You know, change it. If you want to change it, change it. Because those are things that I wish I'd done on the old plot. I wish I'd been brave enough to kind of just feel like, no, I don't like how this is laid out. I'm just going to start afresh. So that was one of the things that I was thinking about with the new plot. And so we moved some slabs, we positioned the greenhouse, and yeah, thanks to Mark, thanks to Becky for helping me out once more with these big move things. And we got the greenhouse into the right place, and I'm really happy with how that sits, and that there's a path that goes directly all the way up to the greenhouse. Now, it does go off on either side when you get to the greenhouse and you come back round, but I like that, because I think the other thing you might want to think about is how you break up a plot. So although it's nice to have a straight shot all the way down, and indeed I've got that between mine and Mark's side, but I also wanted it so that there were different sections of the plot, you know, so I'm going to have the front beds, I'm going to have this middle section, I've got the greenhouse, and then the sections either side of those. Then behind that, I've got what is currently a brassica bed, what I think I'm going to make into a proper fruit tree guild, then some raised beds, then the polytunnel, and then you've got the section behind the polytunnel that has the greenhouse. And I think I'm quite happy with the way in which that therefore sections out the plot, and in some ways I think will feel more manageable. So you're working on this section of the plot at certain times. The other thing that I was really taking into consideration was the size of the beds. You'll know that one of the things that was really difficult on the old plot was the size of the beds. They were huge. You had to walk on them in order to get to different parts of it. And on the second year, I ended up putting raised beds on top of those beds, but that sort of wasted a lot of growing space. Now, because I've got all the slabs on this one, it means that there are very defined growing spaces, and actually they're not too big. They're very manageable. And I could put some raised beds around. I've got them, so I may do that at some point. But even just as it's bare layout right now, it feels like those are manageable beds for me. So we'd got the plot uncovered, we positioned the greenhouse, and then, honestly, got a little bit overexcited, and something happened that's maybe a little bit controversial. Now, the new plot is a dug plot. You know, Graham dug that plot, and he dug it freshly before he handed it over to me, and then covered it in the black plastic. When we took the black plastic off, because I'd piled so much stuff on it from the plot move, and because we'd had to move those slabs around and things, there was quite a lot of compaction in the beds. Mark had just rotavated his plot. The rotavator was there. It had been my intention to broad fork each of the beds to relieve that compaction and get them ready for the spring. But in the excitement of the moment, with the rotavator right there, I went for it. Now, I'm a little bit torn about this. Do I regret it? Maybe, but it's happened. There are things at the time that I didn't consider, which I should have, especially being a veganic gardener. So it wasn't even on my horizon to think about the worms, although I've looked up since, and because it was so cold, the worms were hopefully far enough down that they were nicely safe and we weren't disturbing them too much. I think more in my mind at the time was that we were getting the snow. And if I broke up the surface of the soil, it would mean that the snow would penetrate it. And what I've recently learnt is snow is very high in nitrogen. So it's a really good thing to add to your soil. So I knew the snow was coming. And also that we were due this real cold spell. So because the soil was broken up, you were going to get that frost thaw process going on in the soil, which would help further break up, because the soil is still clay. I'm still on the same allotment site. It's much better soil than my old plot, much less waterlogged and compacted. There's a lot more organic matter that has been worked into this one over the years. So it is much better soil than the last one, but it is still clay soil, and it would still benefit, I think, from breaking down further with that frost thaw. Yeah. However, I'm sort of thinking about that decision now after the fact. I have to say it looked really lovely. It just looked so nice. Fresh beds, freshly turned, raked. Yeah, it's done. And yeah, I'm never going to have this completely bare plot again where I can do that. And I won't going forward, because part of what I'm doing is converting this plot into no dig. So it's had this light rotivation, and from this point onwards it'll be being transferred into a no dig plot, and I'll be using the broad fork, adding organic matter to the surface of the soil. So that's the plan going forward. And of course that's another thing to think about when you're starting your plot. Is it going to be a no dig plot? Are you going to dig? Are you going to have a combination of both? I tend to feel like I'm more in the kind of minimal disturbance school now, excluding that rotating that I've just done. So the sun is reminding me that the other thing that you have to think about with a new plot is where the sun is and where your areas of shade are going to be. And this is different to my old plot. It's not the same sun pattern. My old plot was south facing. I was very lucky. It was great. This plot is east facing, but I'm used to the way in which the sun moves on the new plot because it's exactly the same as my home garden. So the sun will rise at the very front of the plot and it will set at the very back of the plot behind the compost bins. And there are fruit trees there, so some shade will be cast, but it will mostly be over the back greenhouse and perhaps onto the polytunnel, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Now, where I've positioned my greenhouse, it's going to get really good sun. So it's going to be along the long side of the greenhouse. We'll get the sun. I may need to shade that. So one of the things that I'm going to think about with my planning of where my crops are going to go is that maybe I'll put my climbing beans on that side of the greenhouse, so it provides a little bit of shade to the greenhouse because it might get too hot during the hottest part of the summer. And then behind the greenhouse, where it will be a bit shadier, I could put in some of the kinds of crops that don't want to be in direct sun and would bolt, like lettuces and coriander, those sorts of crops, maybe some brassicas. And then the hot tub itself is reminding me about water. So thinking about convenience and where things like your water points are, if you're lucky enough to have them on your allotment plot. And maybe that will kind of determine some of the ways that you plan your plot, like where your pathways might be. Now I'm lucky on this plot. I've got a water point that's one plot in one direction and two plots in the other direction. It's actually on the corner of what will be my sister's new plot. So that's water that is coming from the mains, but I've also got loads of water collection on the main plot, including an IBC tank, and there's water collection on the polytunnel. On the greenhouse, I'll put water collection on the new greenhouse as well, and I brought one of the water butts down from the old plot so it can be positioned next to the greenhouse. So water is one of the things to think about. Oh, and storage was the other thing that I was thinking about for convenience. I had a shed on the old plot that fit all my stuff in perfectly. On the new plot, I'm sharing a shed with Mark, and I think we have already established that we have far too much stuff between us for one small shed. Now, there is space on my side to put a new shed behind the existing greenhouse on the plot by the compost bays. I think that's the ideal place for it. Talking about sun, that's one of the shady spots, so good place to put a shed. I just need to find one and buy one. So yeah, I'll be looking out on Facebook Marketplace and any kind of deals that are going around. And I might actually talk to the site steward as well, because there might be people on the plot who have several sheds and might want to get rid of some. So I'll do that. But yeah, I think that's high on the agenda at the moment, is finding a shed for my plot. Now, I mentioned compost bays. I'm lucky enough that there are already compost bays built, many of them built on the new plot. So that's not something that I have to think about. They're tucked away at the very back of the plot. That's kind of my preference. I don't, I like to think about the aesthetics of the plot too. I want my plot to look, it's a place for utility, but I do want it to look quite nice. And if you were to stick compost bays at the very front of the plot or in the middle of the plot, I just don't think that looks that good. However, a lot of the books will tell you that that's what you should be doing, that that's the most practical and convenient place to put your compost heaps. So maybe if I was redesigning the plot more fully, I might move them for convenience sake. But to be honest, I feel like the aesthetics would override that decision, and I'm quite happy to have them tucked at the back of the plot. So those are the kind of major areas to get sorted from the start. So you've got your layout, you know your plan of your beds, you've decided where your paths are, what they're going to be made out of. Don't drink hot tub water. You know where you're collecting your water, you know where your compost bays, you know where your big structures are. All of those things are done. You're probably at the point where you can start thinking about what you actually want to plant on your plot. So now we get to the fun bit for me, because, I'm not brilliant at DIY. I always need help to be moving things and doing structural things. But planting is the thing that I actually want to do. I want to know where my crops are going to go and do that kind of planning and what I'm going to be growing on my space. So one of the things that I've tried to do this year is be far more organized than I've ever been in any previous year. So I have done the layout of the plot. I've done it in Excel. It's to scale. And I've started putting in the sorts of things that are already on the plot. So I've already got some perennials growing on the plot, and I've put my brassicas out and those sorts of things. So they're already into the plan. Oh, and my garlic is already in. But what I've also done is a planting plan. So I've got a calendar for all the things that I want to sow over the year and when I want to sow them. This was a big job. This took a lot of time. I went through all of my seed folders. I looked at all the varieties that I've got and when the best time to sow them is. And I really kept in mind that I want to stagger my sowings this year, because I easily get overwhelmed. I've talked before about, sorry, Dory barking there. I've talked before, your head's in the video now. I've talked before about being a bit of a binge sower, and yeah, I easily get kind of overwhelmed as the season progresses. So I've tried to stagger my sowings much more, think about successional sowing as well, and just generally spread stuff out so that I can avoid overwhelm. And you can see what's on my list for the second week of January there. It's sow broad beans and do my chilies. Also get the field beans out, but I'm waiting till next week now to do that because, of course, the ground is very frozen at the moment. And also I'm at the lodge. But before I came to the lodge, I did get my chilies sown and I did sow my broad beans. And we'll be talking more about those next week. It's hopefully going to be a really exciting 2025. Cheers.